Something's wrong. Canada is changing for the worse from the inside out, and Jordan Peterson just pointed the finger at who's responsible for it. The conversation you're about to watch confirms many things about Justin Trudeau's leadership, that perhaps stealing from Canada the democracy and rights that used to define it. There's so much to talk about here, but I want you to watch this clip before we dive into it.
Trudeau, who was struggling to maintain popularity, to maintain his government, picked a divisive wedge issue, because it was a divisive wedge issue, imposed it on Canadians, and then attempt to insist that it was justified by the science. So he risked splitting the country apart and pitting people against each other, personally and socially, to facilitate his government's grip on power.
That's what it appears to be at this point, yeah.
Oh boy. It's no wonder no Canadian newspaper would publish that. That's hardly a story at all. And I heard the same thing about operations at the provincial government levels in Canada from very reliable sources, that all this so-called reliance on science was complete bloody nonsense, and that what was instead happening was that governments were conducting opinion polls like mad, which is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but often is, and ruling on that basis, deriving policy on that basis, so on the basis of public fear and whim, and then passing that off as scientific. And that's pretty horrible. They didn't trust the Trudeau government at all. And so there were all sorts of people, and some of them, I suppose, were conspiratorial in their inferences, but many weren't, who thought there's something fishy going on here. I don't trust this a bit.
When you see this kind of policy implemented by governments, there are three things you can primarily do. I mean, you can accept it, you can fight it, or you can run away. Running away wasn't an option for us. Accepting it wasn't an option. So how can we fight it? We're not in politics. The opposition parties throughout the summer of 2021 were weak. I mean, Erin O'Toole, I think, just demonstrated an extraordinary lack of vision and weakness throughout the summer of 2021 by seemingly going along with Trudeau rather than actually opposing him. It's quite possible that Trudeau and the government, in doing what they've done, have very badly misread the numbers, if nothing else. I think they maybe thought that people fell into one of two camps. Either they would be people that would be pro-mandates or people that would be against them. I mean, maybe Trudeau's done us all a favour by pushing Canada towards the end of what some might see as a political adolescence.
That's perhaps the only silver lining to this dark cloud. The Canadian people have smartened up, and perhaps in a paradoxical sense, Justin Trudeau's 8-year reign as Prime Minister has made it a lot more difficult for a character like him to make a resurgence. A report from just last month revealed how Canadian trust in government is at an all-time low, with overall faith in politicians at just 17% in the country. Just 1 in 4 people think the government at any level is capable of solving the massive housing crisis right now in Canada, but that's somewhat beside the point because it's the symptom of a much deeper problem that has to do with Justin Trudeau himself. His compassionate and democratic public image that shot him to power was betrayed during the 2021 lockdowns and mandates, and even more so by his response to the Truckers' Freedom Convoy. There's 2 critical legislative events that made this abundantly clear in both cases. One is the Order in Council implemented in August of 2021 by overriding the majority parliamentary vote, and then the Canadian Emergencies Act later in 2022 that temporarily expanded Justin Trudeau's powers to create the most stringent travel restrictions to crack down on the truckers to quell their dissent. It's not just about the actions alone, but the dangerous authoritarian precedent set by Justin Trudeau, especially when he used his expanded powers under the Emergencies Act to freeze more than 200 bank accounts of ordinary Canadian citizens, and holding hostage more than $7.8 million Canadian dollars of hard-earned money by the people. The ill-conceived and hasty travel restrictions, unlike anything else in the world, also cost Canadian tourism up to $37 billion, not to mention the massive dent in Canada's democratic reputation as a result.
Well, I was thinking when Trudeau called the truckers misogynists and bigots and said that they were fomenting a rebellion in Ottawa, let's say financed by MAGA Republicans of all the preposterous things, I thought, because I was down in the States when that was happening, talking to Americans, telling them that this was the story, and they were like open-jawed in amazement, including the Democrats, that anyone would ever possibly believe that. And then I thought, well, you better give the devil his due. Why would Canadians be willing to fall for that, let's say? And then I thought, well, here's the story, man. It's like for 150 odd years, we've really been able to evince a reasonable trust in our political institutions. All three political parties, from right to left, governed with some degree of credibility and decency and predictability. And then the legacy media did their job being responsible critics. And I say you could even say that of the CBC for many years. And the education system was reliable and the legal system wasn't taken over by DEI warriors and so forth. And now all that's, or a lot of that, has changed. And so now Canadians were being asked by their prime minister to accept one of two stories. Either the truckers, for example, were misogynists and bigots hell-bent on destabilizing Canadian democracy, or you could no longer trust the government in a fundamental sense, or the legacy media, and God only knows how much of the education system and the courts. And so, in some sense, for a sensible and conservative people, the logical choice there was to, well, assume the lesser devil and think that the truckers and the anti-vaxxers, so-called, and so forth, were, a fringe misogynist and bigot group, and that everything in the background was really running as it should be. But as Rupa's story indicates, and as I said, I heard exactly the same story several months ago from high-level consultants to provincial governments across Canada, that they were doing the same thing, ruling by poll, post hoc justifying it by science.
See what I mean? The biggest damage that an authoritarian does is not just by restricting freedom and dissent, but the multiple institutions he needs to destroy their order to get away with it. Looking at Canada in the last few years, that's what you see even with neutral enterprises like science and journalism that are only one of a few sense-making mechanisms still left. Everything becomes a means to a totalitarian end, and what happens when the mask finally falls off? Well, those same people in power look for legitimacy in every nook and corner they can find and end up doing the most damage in the process. I think we got a vivid example of that when Justin Trudeau's faux moralizing on the environment and climate change gave us one of the steepest carbon tax systems in the Western world. Simply put, individuals and businesses were forced to pay the Canadian government a carbon tax that was proportionate to the amount of carbon emissions they created. It started from $10 per ton in 2021 and right now stands at $50 per ton. And the result of that? This blatant redistribution economic policy has ended up making cheap energy from fossil fuels a lot less feasible, creating a wave of high prices for local products and lower competitiveness in the international market. It's truly incredible how a democracy that the world once used to look up to has adopted policies and ideas on the far left that can hardly be matched.
Her claim fundamentally is that this was nothing but blatant, cynical, narcissistic politicking of the lowest order. And we might say, well, no, that's probably an oversimplification. There must have been some other justification generated like in good faith and then also post hoc as at least as a cover-up. But essentially, in some sense, what you seem to be saying is that you've uncovered very little evidence of any of that in the cross-examinations. So even as a scam, it wasn't a very good one.
There's a principle in governance, which is this. Governments can't just create any policies that they like. There's a difference between the government and the legislature. And anything a government does in terms of making rules, it has to have authorization to do in a statute that the legislature has passed. The fact of the matter is that governments make policies that are politically motivated all the time. And they're allowed to do that as long as they can fit them within the authority that they have in a statute. But the problem for the government in this respect is this, that the rationale that they've given, if they've given one at all, does not fit within the authority that the Aeronautic Act gives. So in other words, the minister is allowed to create interim orders that have to do with the safety of the airline industry, of the passengers, the crew and so on.
I think this is a perfect example of how easy it is for bad policy at the top to branch out into a dozen more problems lower into the economy. Justin Trudeau's lockdown policies were not just questionable when it comes to individual rights, but even threatened to bankrupt entire sectors of the economy, like the airline and transportation industry. And then, what was done to cope with that? The Canadian government threw money at the problem in the form of redistributionist subsidy programs like the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility, which provided bridge funds to make sure the industry could still pay out employees and keep standing financially. Years later, Canadians are indirectly paying for those costs by the inflation of their currency and rising costs across the economy. In the end, the one wrong move has to be justified by the other, and the ultimate person to bear the cost is always the working citizen from the bottom. Justin Trudeau's prime ministership is an interesting case study in how far a leader can go from the democratic credentials that he promised his people. It's easy to sell utopian visions from the outside, but a lot harder to stay true to them in office. I think that wouldn't be news to someone like Jordan Peterson, who's studied history enough to understand how the pattern among populist socialists usually pans out. Justin Trudeau does not have a long road ahead of him as Canada's leader, but the country will still need to do a lot to reclaim many of the rights and ideals it used to stand for. But the fact that there's a voice like Jordan Peterson stirring minds and conversations among Canadians certainly gives me hope that it is possible.